where do your hormones need to be in order to have a productive cutting phase?
We need to make sure your insulin is sensitized, right? And there are some really key ways to sensitize your insulin. Now, I've alluded to these throughout what we've talked about, and it just really, when you start to realize that the pieces of the puzzle that come together are actually really simple, sometimes it's like, it takes some of the overwhelm out, but it also removes a lot of the excuses, and then people go, oh, okay, maybe I can really do this.
Yeah.
And so when we think about insulin sensitivity, one of the key things you can do is eat more protein and lift some heavy weights, right? So those are the things that are going to resensitize your insulin. Another thing that can be great is after a meal, going for a light walk, 20 to 30 minutes. It starts to enhance that glucose uptake, that blood sugar uptake, and regulate things from there. Now, if we've gotten to a point where we have overridden our hunger cues and we are suppressing our appetite constantly and just eating, we've maybe overeaten in the past, you may have done some damage to what we call our hunger and fullness hormones, so your ghrelin and your leptin, and that can create something called your leptin resistance. And so sometimes it's a matter of retraining that as well.
Welcome along to the Lifting in Life podcast. I'm Cam, I'm the host. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, I'm a personal trainer, and I also work in IT. Today, I'm joined by Sheree Beaumont once again. She is a nutritionist and coach who specialises in gut, hormone, and holistic health. As you would have seen, this episode is focused on fat loss. So, as you can imagine, we chat about the classic things, input, output, calorie expenditure, tracking your progress, when to make changes, all of that kind of stuff. But with Sheree's expertise, she delves into ideas like intuitive eating, and then the hormone balance piece. So we deep dive into hormones like insulin, cortisol, leptin, ghrelin, and the thyroid. So it's not just your typical kind of fat loss conversation where it's just eat less, do more. We delve into more of the complexities behind it and how you can do it as a sustainable lifestyle change. It's not just doing a 12-week challenge. It's about making these sustainable changes that you can implement for the rest of your life. As always, I appreciate you tuning into the podcast, and any support you can show goes a long way, and it helps me continue getting these awesome people on. I hope you enjoy the episode, and remember, you make you.
First or something, and you kind of get the flow.
You quite often hear people like, oh, we were chatting beforehand and then we decided we should probably hit record.
Yeah. Exactly. All right. Speaking of hitting record, we've hit the record button, so we should probably get into it. Sheree, thanks heaps for joining me again. Our first one, I thought there was just so much that we could dive into that. I just wanted to get you back on again. And then, like we were chatting about for the podcast, see, this is what podcasting. I know that you've initiated or in a bit of a cutting phase right now too. So I just thought it was perfect timing to get you back on and do a deep dive into fat loss and the ins and outs of it and maintaining a healthy hormone balance and all the work. So appreciate you coming back on again.
Oh, and I'm super excited to be here. I loved it last time and you asked great questions. So it's really fun to deep dive into things.
Nice. I appreciate that. I try. So where I thought was a logical place to start a fat loss episode is actually talking about starting a fat loss phase. Kind of intuitively felt like it made sense. So what does initiating a fat loss phase look like for you and your clients? Is there a typical way that you start it? Are there ways that you can maybe set yourself up for success or have more success in the fat loss phase? What does it look like when you actually start it?
I think the biggest thing is deciding what the goal is, right? And I come from a very holistic place, a very holistic background. And so it's not always the number on the scales or even the body fat, measurements as per se. That being said, personally, I am doing the body fat because that I know is the best way for me to track, and it doesn't mess with my mind anywhere near as much as stepping on the scales does. But I think having that end goal in mind, and I'll say to my clients, do you want to fit back into a favorite pair of jeans? Is it feeling really confident when you step out on the beach, in a bikini? Is it knowing that you've actually have hit under a certain number on the scales because personally that's where you felt really good at? And so I think it's kind of just like any goal, or the way I look at it anyway, is working backwards. You set that goal of where you want to be, and then how do we break it into little micro goals, because otherwise it seems very unattainable, very overwhelming, and really hard to achieve. So I think that's really the first place you want to start, and giving yourself enough time. I often get people being like, oh, I'd love to lose, 5-10 kilos by this point. And I'm like, yeah, that's not going to happen in a healthy way. So I really can't support that or advocate for that.
Yeah, 100%. And when it comes to setting a time frame, is there any rough framework or anything that you go by when it comes to setting that time frame for how long you or people that you train will be in a fat loss phase for?
I think it's hugely a mental component. And if you're doing it a little bit more relaxed, like if I think about myself, it was like, this isn't a hardcore shred where I'm counting calories or I'm counting macros or I'm watching everything that goes into my body. I'm just being very mindful. But generally speaking, I say to people like, look, let's be realistic and give ourselves time to factor in a plateau, to factor in the fact that hormones are doing all sorts of different things, to let the basal metabolic rate pick up, all that sort of thing. And if you are looking at it from a kilogram perspective, you're particularly looking at around, 0.5 to 1 kg per week. Anything faster than that, like I always say to my clients, the faster it comes off, the faster it's going to go back on. And you want to be able to get your body to its set point and its new set point and be able to maintain that. And so quite often what will happen is people lose all the weight, they'll lose it quite rapidly, and then they don't maintain it because they don't know how to maintain it. They've done some sort of extreme diet to get there, and their body hasn't really played catch up. They're not feeling safe in that space. Their body isn't feeling safe in that space, and it's constantly trying to get back to where you were. And that is why so many people will not only put the weight back on that they lost, but put on even more after that because they felt so deprived for such a long time.
Yeah, those are really good points, and that kind of leads me on to something I wanted to deep dive into. And it comes to your approach with fat loss, but what are your fundamentals when it comes to fat loss? And there are obviously a lot of things that can fit in there. You've already mentioned a whole bunch there, but we're thinking like, obviously we got calories, cardio, weight training, hormone balance, whether you even stick to a specific nutrition plan or you follow macros, or there's so many things that can go into it. So what are your fundamentals when it comes to fat loss?
My fundamentals are focusing on your protein intake, making sure your insulin is regulated, you are sensitizing your body to insulin, because a lot of the reason why people can't lose weight or they feel like they've tried everything they can't lose it is because they've built up an insulin resistance. So it really is making sure you are doing everything you can to sensitize your body to insulin, and we can touch on that in a little bit if you want me to dive deeper. But essentially it really is that protein intake, making sure a lot of people are told that we're getting way too much, and we really aren't. Absolute bare minimum, 1.8 grams per kg of body weight, and that's for females. And that's actually a lot. Like if you aren't getting 100 to 120 grams a day of protein as a woman, you're not going to be satiated. Your protein isn't going to, your hormones aren't going to be balanced. Your body just isn't going to be getting the nutrients it really needs. And then we start to fill up our plate with more carbs and more fats because we're hungry or we're snackish or our blood sugars are dysregulated.
Yeah, and that protein, especially getting that amount in, actually takes a very concerted effort. You don't, I saw this thing today, it was like, you don't accidentally hit your protein goals. And I think it's so relevant, even like for 100 to 120 grams. That's at least like 3-4 meals of a decent sized protein portion.
100%. And when I start to get my clients to just become aware of how much protein they're putting in, that's when they go, oh, wow, yeah, I really wasn't eating enough. And so when we think about this idea of calorie counting, just focusing on the protein makes it so much simpler, because then we're not going, oh, have I hit this exact macro for everything else? Have I hit these exact calories? It's like, you can't overeat a chicken breast, right? Your body's going to tell you when you're full. And so you just aiming to hit the protein goals tends to make everything else fall into place. But it does sometimes require a little bit of education. I think we talked about last time, 2 eggs isn't enough for breakfast because you're only getting about 12 grams of protein there. So how can we top you up? What can we get creative with? And how can we make sure that right from the get-go, you're hitting at least 30 grams in the morning and then making it subsequent from there?
Yeah, that's so true. That's another thing I saw is like, you can't overeat on whole foods.
No.
If you have a plate of, I don't know, potatoes and chicken breast, you're not just going to sit there and mindlessly eat it. It'll become a mission. It's not like a bag of chips or something that's, giving you a lot, where it's just easy that you have to stop yourself from eating it. Something like a chicken breast and potatoes or kumara or something, you're not going to just mindlessly eat it all.
No, and if you're adding in the greens like you should be, there's also going to be a whole lot of fiber that will fill you up as well. And so it is, you can't overeat on broccoli. You can't overeat anything like that, because your body is really, really intelligent, and it's going to tell you when it's full.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the plan and, the protein goals and the calorie goals and things, what is your approach there? Do you provide a specific plan? Do you provide macros? What does that sort of look like?
We really just focus on the whole food component, because ultimately some of the reason why we're holding on to weight in the first place is because there's high levels of inflammation in the body, whether that's from excess sugar consumption, excess caffeine consumption, excess stress. So it really is, okay, let's boil it back down to being mostly whole foods, not all whole foods, and really hitting that protein. So say you wanted to, and my maths is terrible, so let me try not to do maths. But say you wanted to get to, 70 kilos, right? Instead of going, okay, I want 1.8 grams per kg of body weight for where I'm at now, you'd go, I want to do 1.8 grams of protein per kg of body weight of where I want to be. Right. And you'd work that out. And that's how you kind of get that foundation. That's how you kind of build in from there. And then if you've got your protein component, then you're adding, I always say to my clients, you carry your portion sizes with you. So instead of going down this path of counting calories, it's like, look at your hands. Okay. So your protein is your hand. You've got about the palm for red meat thickness. You've got up to about the knuckles for your chicken, and you got the whole hand for your fish, right? A little nice for me to remember it.
I like the movement too.
Yeah, a little bit. Then you've got a woman, you need to at least hit 30% of your diet to come from fat. So you've got 2 thumbs of fat intake. Then you've got around 1 fist full of carbohydrates, and then 2 fists full of fiber or micronutrients. So your salad or your non-starchy vegetables. And honestly, if you're building your plate like that, it's really hard to go wrong.
That's interesting. And taking that approach, what would you do when it comes to implementing changes? We're kind of getting onto a different point, but when it comes to implementing changes, if you're using consistent measures like that, could you argue that maybe eating that all the time would eventuate in you plateauing and not progressing further?
Yeah, and that's where, we bring in an element of intuitive eating, and we bring in an element of like tracking. We are tracking your progress every couple of weeks. We've got those micro goals. Okay, so we got to, we dropped the 2 kilos in the 2 weeks that we wanted to initially. Cool, we dropped the next 2 kilos. We dropped the next 2 kilos. Now we're at 8 weeks, which is typically somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks is where people start to plateau. Right? The body is adjusted. It's had its bit of a reset. It's feeling really good. It's got rid of the crappy foods for the most part. So it's doing what it needs to do, and then we can start to plateau. And that's when we need to look at other factors. It's not necessarily that we have to change the food. Is your metabolic rate a little bit slower? Have you got a great baseline? Have you actually trained your body enough to, we know that muscle burns so much more calories at rest than fat does. Are you carrying muscle mass? During the course of, when I work with clients, you're already starting to implement those sorts of things to prevent that plateau. You are hitting the weights, you are getting your steps in, you are doing the things day to day to really start to boost your metabolism as well. So it's not just coming at it from a restrictive point of view, because I do work with so many people who have come from an eating disorder background, myself included. And so the idea of counting calories, weighing food, measuring things can be very, very triggering.
And also, it can be a very unsustainable approach too. Are you really, if you become so accustomed to always measuring things, does that mean you're always going to feel the need to measure things just 24/7 all year round? Which some people might be okay with that, but what if you want to make lasagna for dinner? How are you going to measure? You know what I'm saying? You can't always have chicken, rice, and broccoli, and it's all segmented out. So is that kind of an element of that approach too, where it's sort of, I suppose, building a healthier relationship with food that's sustainable in the long run?
100%. And like I mentioned earlier, like the intuitive eating is a huge component to it. And sometimes it takes a while because we kind of trained to ride over our hunger cues. For years, even generations before us, you think about it, you're told you can't leave the table until you've cleared everything off your plate. We do that with kids. You need to finish your meal. And I get it from some component, like you do want your child to make sure they're eating enough food. But if your child's sitting there going, I'm had enough, and you're sitting there going, no, you need to eat more, what are you actually instilling in their brain? And so for a lot of us, it's actually going, I need to start to listen to those internal hunger cues. Am I actually full, or am I eating it just because it's in front of me? Am I being taught to override that internal sensation? Is it 12 o'clock, therefore lunchtime? Rather than, am I actually hungry in this moment, or could I give it another hour or so? And that's actually going to support my blood sugar levels a little bit better.
Yeah. I remember I was always drilled into that. Like that was always drilled into me growing up. And then I would go stay at my auntie's house and she's like, oh, no, you don't have to eat it all. And I was just like, blew my mind. I was like, wait, what? I don't have to eat all of the food. And like you say, I understand the idea of not being wasteful and all that stuff. But absolutely, if you grow up with that mentality, it only makes sense that whatever is in front of you, you have this built-in, I don't know, desire or just a rule with yourself that you have to finish everything on your plate.
Yeah. And it can be unconscious. You can just naturally think that. And, some of the things that just blow my mind, and when we think about intuitive eating, there's also that mindful eating component. When we slow down and really chew our food, we quite often get fuller a lot faster. I can remember being the last person at my dinner table. My mum used to be, oh my gosh, Sheree, hurry up.
Yeah.
But I'd be sitting there eating my food with my knife and fork, like so slowly, and she would have cleared the whole table and everything by this point because I was such a slow eater. And I can still remember her saying to me, she's like, why aren't you hungry after dinner? And I'm like, see, that's why I wasn't hungry after dinner, because it actually takes about 20 minutes for our body to process food having come in, right? We start to break down like our carbohydrates as soon as they enter the mouth, but it's not till we process the proteins and the fats that we actually get the signal up to the brain to be like, oh, there's food coming in. So if you've devoured your meal in 15 minutes, you're probably going to be looking for something else afterwards, and you're not going to have registered that you're full. Then you overeat, and that's where, we end up putting on the weight as well.
Yeah, that's so true. Pulling it back to the fundamentals a little bit, you've mentioned a whole bunch of things in there. You mentioned like weight training, cardio, and things like activity outside of those stuff like step count. So how do those all factor into a plan? And would you say that it is fundamental or necessary to be weight training, doing some kind of cardio, and focusing on a step count when wanting to lose body fat?
I'm not a cardio fan. There's a time and a place for it. My brain is great for your heart health. It can be great for mental health, and people gravitate towards it, and I get that. But I think it's so ingrained in us that you need to do cardio to lose weight, and we need to reframe this. Again, like I mentioned before, you have the more metabolically active tissue you carry, so the more muscle mass you carry, the more fat you're going to be burning at rest. And I think what people really need to understand is that when you're doing cardio, you are only burning calories in that point in time. HIIT training, a little bit different. You are burning for the next 24 to 48 hours. But with weight training, no, your calories may not be high if you're tracking it on your Apple Watch or something, right? But you are accumulating muscle mass if you are lifting some heavy stuff and putting it back down, right? And I'm not talking about going to a pump class. Sorry, Les Mills. I am talking about getting out on the gym floor and lifting up something that does cause your body to be like, okay, this is a challenge. And so that is going to recruit more muscle fiber. That is going to turn your metabolism on. And I know men are far more inclined to go and do that, but women tend to gravitate towards group fitness classes. And they're great. They're amazing for you, but they're cardio. I'm never going to be convinced otherwise, right? You're doing so many repetitions. You're working on endurance. And what is endurance? It's cardio based. So yes, you do need to be doing some form of true resistance training. And no, body weight resistance is not enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would add on to that because I'm doing a bit of a cut right now for Euro Summer too. There you go. And a guy at work the other day, he saw my Instagram story that I put up, and he said, "Oh hey man, like I saw that you're cutting now. So does that mean with your weight training, you're going to do lower weight and higher reps?" And I was just like, no, and I haven't heard that in a long time, but that is a very it's a misconception that I used to hear quite a lot, especially as a personal trainer. So is that something that you deal with clients too and educate them on, that no, you don't change your weights and your rep ranges just because you're wanting to lose some body fat?
100%. I can still remember saying that to myself when I first started the gym.
Yeah.
Well, because we're wanting to tone, right?
Yes.
12 to 15 rep range. If we're wanting to put on muscle, you do 8 to 12. And it's like crazy now that I think about it. Sometimes my reps will be as low as 5. And I'm just like, let's lift some heavy stuff right now. And I think, honestly, the biggest thing is bringing in some balance. Cardio is going to help push you over the line. But when we think about metabolic rate and fat loss, you are better off doing your steps, because it's the sitting constantly that is making us feel really lethargic, that is holding on to the weight, that is causing the body to kind of be sluggish and slow metabolism. So getting up and doing an hour of cardio, fantastic, but you could be doing like 45-minute superset the crap out of it weight session and have done, average about 7.5 to 10,000 steps a day. And that's going to be far more supportive of your actual building your metabolism, so that when we do go on Euro Summer, or you do go, because normally if we are trying to lose weight, sometimes it can be for day-to-day living, I get that. But if we're doing something like a shred, like both you and I are doing, like a little mini shred, it's normally because you're working towards something and you want to potentially look good for a photo shoot or for something, looking good in the bikini or whatever. Shirtless, so coming from that perspective, you want to make sure your metabolism is optimized so that you can then, when you are relaxing, have a few cocktails on the beach. You can enjoy the pasta when you're in Italy. You can enjoy, indulging a little bit without worrying that your set point is going to go right back up to where it was, because you're not doing 5 hours of cardio a week and lifting heaps of weights. It's like, that's what my body was used to, so that's what I have to do to maintain.
Yeah. So would you say that once you've established the weights and you've got a consistent step count, the element of like dedicated cardio, like an incline walk or something, is just used as a tool as and when needed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you're finding that you're not quite reaching where you want to get, then you've got wiggle room. And I think that's the problem, is that we go all in, we shift all the weight, right, initially, and then we're like, now we're plateauing. And it's like, because you haven't given yourself anything to play with now. You've actually overdone it. Like the amount of females I work with, I now average 20,000 steps a day and I'm eating 1,300 calories. And I'm like, you are destroying your metabolism. Your body now expects for you to eat that little and move that much. My goal is to move this little and eat this much, right?
Exactly.
How can I eat as much food as possible for as little effort and still maintain my physique? That is how you train your metabolism.
Yeah, exactly. And I love the analogy of like tools in a tool bag. If you chuck all your tools out straight away when you first start doing your cutting phase, like where do you go from there? Like you say, 6 weeks, 8 weeks later, when you typically plateau, okay, what are you doing? You're doing an hour of cardio every single day. You're training weights 5 days a week. Your calories at 1200. You can't really do anymore. It's about using the right tool at the right time throughout that process, right?
Yeah. And then you also don't know what kind of damage you're doing. This is when we see people not able to lose weight. This is when we see the thyroid start to go out of whack. This is where we see the blood sugars go out of balance, your hormones, you start to lose your menstrual cycle if you're a female, like all the other side effects that come on, because then we're like, oh, I've got to eat less and I've got to move even more. And we do more and more damage to our bodies.
Yeah. And that is a nice segue. Thank you for that. Into the hormone phase. So you're an expert when it comes to hormone health, hormone regulation, and I'd like to sort of pair up the cutting phase with the hormone knowledge that you have. So maybe how do I want to attack it? I kind of want to attack it two pieces. So like, what does it require from your hormones in order to have a, for want of a better word, good cutting phase, trying to be smart, but a good cutting phase. And then also the second part, what hormonal damage can potentially be done by not doing it well. So the first part, where do your hormones need to be in order to have a productive cutting phase?
So we need to make sure your insulin is sensitized, right? And there are some really key ways to sensitize your insulin. Now, I've alluded to these throughout what we've talked about, and it just really, when you start to realize that the pieces of the puzzle that come together are actually really simple, sometimes it's like, oh, I take some of the overwhelm out, but it also removes a lot of the excuses, and then people go, oh, okay, maybe I can really do this.
Yeah.
And so when we think about insulin sensitivity, one of the key things you can do is eat more protein and lift some heavy weights, right? So those are the things that are going to resensitize your insulin. Another thing that can be great is after a meal, going for a light walk, 20 to 30 minutes, it starts to enhance that glucose uptake, that blood sugar uptake, and regulate things from there. Now, if we've gotten to a point where we have overridden our hunger cues and we are suppressing our appetite constantly and just eating, like we've maybe overeaten in the past, you may have done some damage to what we call our hunger and fullness hormones, so your ghrelin and your leptin, and that can create something called your leptin resistance. And so sometimes it's a matter of retraining that as well. So it will be learning to stop when you're about 80% full, even though you may not feel like you want to stop eating, and teaching the body that it's okay to be slightly hungry and reigniting that fire or that metabolism again, because that's often part of the problem. It's like, oh, well, I'm eating till I'm full or I'm eating till I'm comfortable, but you've overtrained some of your hormone, or you've switched off some of your hormones that are teaching you to stop eating. So there's that component to it as well, and making sure your body is resensitizing itself. So that would be probably the bigger hormone components. Then you've also got to make sure you're checking your thyroid. Like sometimes people automatically can't lose weight because their thyroid is out of balance, whether that's too overactive and they're losing weight too rapidly, or it's too underactive and they're not able to lose weight at all.
Yeah, I'd like to deep dive into each one of those if you want. And the leptin and ghrelin, it's so interesting that you mentioned that, because when it comes to intuitive eating, not that I want to get into these odds right now, just a little side note, when it comes to intuitive eating, if that isn't regulated and you're eating in accordance to that, it's technically not actually what your body wants, because you technically don't actually want to or need to eat, even though you feel hungry. But maybe we'll get to that in a second. The first one you mentioned, insulin.
Yeah.
What is so important about having our insulin at a healthy balance? And maybe actually a step before that, what is insulin responsible for in the body when it comes to consuming foods and wanting to lose body fat?
So insulin is a storage hormone. So you eat a meal. Let's say it's chicken, rice, and broccoli for the sake of making this easy.
Yum.
The great thing about that is you've paired carbs, proteins, hopefully some fats in the oil that you potentially cooked it in, and you got some greens there, right? That is going to slow down the insulin spike. But when food comes into the body, insulin is secreted from the pancreas. that causes that blood sugar to rise. It also is paired with cortisol, and that goes up as well. Now, the body is looking to maintain a stable blood sugar level the entire time that you're existing, right? As soon as you put food in, your blood sugar is going to go up. So insulin's job is to keep it at a really stable level. So it goes, okay, blood sugar's gone up. Let me make sure I take anything excess, right, as a storage hormone and put it into wherever it needs to go. Maybe it's after exercise, great meal. We're going to put some back in our muscles. We're going to replenish what we used from the liver. Okay, we're overeating or over-consuming, or the blood sugar's gone up too high because maybe we didn't have chicken, rice, and broccoli. Maybe instead we just had a packet of chips and the blood sugar shot right through the roof. So what does it do? Oh, it's gone well above the threshold. I'm going to take that and I'm going to store it in the fat cells because my muscle fibers, my muscle stores of glycogen are full. My liver stores of glycogen are full. What do I do with this? I'm going to convert that blood sugar into fat and store it on the body. So that's really how insulin works. And over time, if you continue to eat, and it doesn't even necessarily need to be processed foods, or I hate using the word bad foods, but those foods that don't actually serve and support our body in high quantities. This can be eating those naked carbohydrates that we talked about last time, and too much of those. And that's going to constantly push that insulin up. And the more your body has to secrete insulin, the more often it does, it starts to, again, lose its sensitization to it. So it thinks it needs more and more and more. And so that's where we start to develop that insulin resistance. And then people go, well, why can't I lose weight? Well, because you're not sensitive to the insulin. The insulin is like the key to the cell to unlock, to store things in the right place. So does that make sense?
Yep. No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. It's just such an interesting system within the body. And when we think of weight loss, so often it's just calories in, calories out. And that is the fundamentals of it. But like you say, if your insulin isn't within balance, then your body isn't going to be, maybe it's best described as efficient as losing weight. Like the furnace or the way it can burn isn't as efficient as it could be.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the other thing you got to look at too is, like I was talking to a colleague the other day, and they were saying it was ridiculous. They did a massive hike throughout all of New Zealand, right? That top to tail, burning about 6,000 calories a day, eating about 1,500. He's like, I thought I'd be shredded by the end of it. And I wasn't. I still had that little pouch on my belly. And it's like, yeah, so it's not just down to calories in, calories out. The body is always going to hold on to what it thinks it needs for survival. It comes down to that fight or flight response. And you do go into famine mode when you're in a calorie deficit, which is making sure you support your body through that.
Yeah, exactly. And moving on to the leptin and ghrelin, could you explain those a little bit further and sort of how we relate it to the intuitive eating piece, and how intuitive eating is a really good thing to do for your body, but how maybe sometimes in relation to these two hormones, I don't know, they might confuse what you think is your intuitive sense when it's actually not what your body wants.
Yeah, so ghrelin is your hunger hormone. It's when you get that little gurgly sensation in your tummy, or you're like, oh, I'm kind of hungry now. So that's ghrelin. And that's what you almost want to listen for when you are intuitively eating. However, if we are thinking about that fight or flight response, we're constantly stressed, your ghrelin's going to be suppressed. That's why I get, clients come in, they're like, yeah, I could easily go for hours without eating. And I'm like, okay, do not ever understand that concept.
Yeah.
But it's because their ghrelin is being suppressed, their cortisol is probably too high, and their body is being told that it doesn't really need food right now. It's primarily focused on keeping itself alive, right? And so there's the potential for the ghrelin to be suppressed. The other thing I'll mention here is that there's a huge difference between hunger and appetite. And so ghrelin can come online when you're actually truly hungry. But appetite can trigger that false sense of hunger because you may smell the food, Have you ever watched TV and been like, oh, that looks really nice?
Yeah.
I'm all of a sudden hungry. Even though you've had dinner, you are sitting there fully satisfied and you're like, I could probably go for some dessert now that I've seen that on the TV, right? You've seen it. Maybe it's you've smelt it. Someone's like cooking something and you've finished your meal for the day. Taste. So this is, everyone's like, oh, I've got a dessert stomach. I've got a second stomach for dessert. When you change the taste of something, or if you get the taste for something you like and you're like, oh, well, I'll probably just like some potato chips or something like that. They're moreish. Once you start, you want more. It's not that you're actually hungry, but your appetite is there. And so that's another thing that can be really hard and really confusing when it comes to intuitive eating, because you're not actually relying on your ghrelin. You're utilizing our appetite as per se. And so then when we train our bodies to rely on our appetite, we can suppress that leptin and we can override that. So whether that's making sure we complete a meal even when we're full, whether that is over consuming food in general, whether that is having high processed foods. If you, for example, you're eating a Big Mac, so high in calories, but it's such a small little thing, you don't quite associate it in the right way in the body. So you can easily overeat because it's also not going to fill you up and satisfy you in a way that if you had made a homemade burger, it would. And so it's that leptin resistance, just like I was talking about the insulin resistance, that can develop, and our body starts to override those internal cues saying, hey, I've had enough, I'm full, it's registered in the belly, stop eating now. It's like, oh, what else can I have? Because you've actually shut off the feedback loop. You've shut off the biochemical pathway, the mechanism in your body to tell you that you're full. And that's where it can make intuitive eating really, really hard.
To me, it almost sounds like it's the dopamine system that's overriding it. Do you think that's what it could be?
I would actually have to look into that. That's a really good...
It just feels like it, if you think about having ice cream, for instance, you're like, I'd love an ice cream. You imagine yourself having the ice cream, then you have the ice cream, you're like, yeah, this feels good. And that's almost what it sounds like, because you wouldn't, you might, but you probably wouldn't be like, oh man, I feel like a boiled potato right now. Like, yeah, I would love to have a boiled potato. It just doesn't really do it. Where I think it's like the dopamine, it feels like it's almost the reward system that it's leveraging.
Mm-hmm.
That's just kind of what it feels like. What do you think?
Yeah, it can definitely be driven by that reward center and that pleasure center. And I find a lot of people will gravitate towards something like chocolate or ice cream from the sense of magnesium and calmness that it can give you as well. So we've got to think about what's also driving this on a deep level. Are we led towards the sugar because we're actually overstressed and our magnesium is shot and we need to actually just top up our magnesium levels? Or are we craving, like you say, something that is not really going to serve us versus, I remember, parents always used to be like, well, if you're still hungry, you can have an apple. If you're not hungry for the apple, you're not hungry. And it's like, it's so true. But when you're an adult, you don't have that level of parenting in there.
You can do whatever you want.
And so we override it. It's that high. And if you think about dopamine versus serotonin, serotonin is our long-lasting hormone. It is that fulfillment. It's that feeling that you get when you give someone a gift or you do something for someone and it lights you up inside. Whereas dopamine is a very short, quick fix. It's that quick firing. There's a lot less receptors of the dopamine in the brain. And that's going to be like, oh, we want more, we want more. And nowadays, there are so many chemicals in the food that know exactly how to target those dopamine receptors to encourage you to want more, suppress that leptin, and overeat as well. So we're dealing with so much here.
Yeah, and I just haven't heard it that separation between appetite and hunger. I've never really heard it described that way, but intuitively you can sense the difference, right? Exactly like when you finish your big roast chicken or something, I don't know, and you're super full. So intuitively you're not hungry, but your appetite for a cheesecake. I got an appetite for a cheesecake. So that's really interesting. And then there are a couple of other hormones you mentioned there. Maybe I will drill into the cortisol a little bit because you touched on that there. And I've done a couple of bodybuilding shows. My partner Chloe, she's a pro IFBB athlete, and she's done way more than I have. And cortisol is always something, especially when it comes to bodybuilding. Obviously, you're wanting to get super shredded. So, like, I have, through my own experience and vicariously through others, learned a bit about how cortisol can act on the body while cutting. But could you maybe explain it a little bit further and why it's important to keep our cortisol levels at a good, I don't want to say low, because I don't know if it's ever possible to always have low cortisol levels, but to keep them at a reasonable level throughout a cutting phase?
And you actually don't want your cortisol levels to be low either. You want them to be balanced.
Yeah.
Low cortisol is actually very similar symptomology to high cortisol, right? We get to the point where we crash and we burn. And so you just want to be operating predominantly out of that parasympathetic state. So your rest and digest, your reproduction, and your repair. And so if you are doing something like a show, and I'm sure they stress this to you if you had a coach, the rest is just as important, because you're hitting the gym twice a day, if not 3 times a day. You're doing double cardio sessions to get on stage. And this is very different to what you would be saying to people like Gen Pop that are just wanting to shift some weight, right? You're trying to get down. Like, I know one of the guys that I used to see at the gym all the time, like, he got down to 2% body fat when he stepped on stage. Like, that is a very, very different level of training that it takes to get to that point. And so you want to make sure that you are resting and recovering so that the body can repair, and you aren't going to have those high levels of cortisol, because you are putting copious amounts of stress. You're stressing it out in the famine response. You're stressing it out by exercising potentially 3 times a day. You're stressing it out through the fact that there is this nervousness in terms of prepping towards a show. And so it is, sounds ridiculously simple, but coming back to things like your breath, making sure you're getting probably more sleep than you normally would, so that you are giving your body optimal time to recover. You're upping your magnesium. You'd know the importance of protein during this time, because protein's not just there for making sure you have the muscle mass. It's a huge part of your recovery phase as well. And so when we think about the impact that cortisol can have, it's really just trying to keep the body safe. And so if you can constantly communicate to the body that you're safe, and I think, if we think about way back when I was at uni, and it was like bodybuilding was such a big thing then. And everyone was like, oh, you have 5 to 6 small meals a day. In some way, that also supports that cortisol level, because the body's going, oh, there's food coming in, there's food coming in, there's food coming in. There's a level of safety. So it's when we go prolonged periods without food that's going to shove that cortisol level right up to the sky, that's going to shunt the insulin up super high, and it's going to cause more fat storage. So there is actually a method to the madness of having, walk around with those giant lunchbox things with about 6 different Tupperware containers in them, because you're not eating every 2 hours, but you are eating every 3 to 4 to keep teaching the body that it's safe enough and that there's food coming in, and that calms the body and the cortisol levels down as well.
So would you say the main piece when it comes to struggling to shift fat and having high cortisol levels is because it increases the amount of insulin? Is that the main piece there?
And also just the level, if the body doesn't feel safe. So if we think back to the caveman days, if the body doesn't feel safe, that thinks that there is a famine going on in the world, it is going to hold on to weight as fat store. Like, it's going to store fat, because it's like, well, I don't know when he or she's going to feed me again. We just need to make sure that there's little fat stores there, because we may have to get through a winter. Think about a bear hibernating, right? They don't eat for how long, because they've got so much fat that they store. We can't go and do that, but it's a similar kind of mechanism, because our body is like, well, this famine could last 2 to 3 weeks. We're not actually that far out from when that was actually a thing. And our brains haven't caught up with that yet. And so when we start to understand that concept, it isn't aware that there's a supermarket 5 minutes down the road, and you can go and stuff your face with as much food as possible when you get home, right? It doesn't understand that concept, because it's got so many years and years and decades and centuries of programming. And so it does really come back to making sure the body knows that it's safe, making sure we're optimizing digestion, and then not, I guess, overeating to the insulin then ends up storing a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah. And the other one you mentioned there, which sounds very important, was the thyroid. And the thyroid is actually something that I don't know a whole heap about. Like, I might have listened to a couple of podcasts or something on it, so know maybe some bits and pieces, but it's definitely not something I've deep dived into. So I'd be quite interested to hear how it sort of works in the body and its importance in a fat loss phase. So could you speak to it, and if it's not working how it should, what the negative impacts could be in relation to us losing body fat?
I mean, more often than not, you're going to see someone who has hypothyroidism. And so hypo, low, slow. That's the easiest way to remember it. I always liken it to a sloth. Hyperactive. It's fast-paced. I think about the cheetah, right? So if you think about those two animals, it starts to make things a little bit easier for the brain to grasp. And we're thinking more predominantly around this fat loss piece. I'll focus on that hypothyroidism, which is more and more prevalent in today's world, today's society, because some of the key nutrients that actually support our thyroid health are missing from our soils. And so if it's not in our soil, it's not enough food. And that can slow down weight loss. That is why we're seeing so many people struggle with weight loss as well now. So the thyroid is a little butterfly gland in your neck. And that is what is plays a huge role in regulating your metabolism. Now, if your thyroid levels aren't optimized, it's going to slow down your metabolism. It's also going to slow a lot of other things down, right? It'll slow down hair growth. It will slow down your body's ability to even clear your bowels effectively. Like if you think about slow, like what does that look like in the body? And so obviously weight gain is going to be one of the biggest things. We think about the flip side of that, we're going to see things like anxiety. So if you've got the slow metabolism, you may also experiencing things like depression. It's that low mood, low kind of everything, and the body isn't working for you. And so when it comes to thyroid health, one of the first things I do with all my clients is actually do a complete blood panel, because at least then we can see, is their thyroid going to be playing a role in this weight loss component? Do we have to do something to reset the thyroid to get it back into playing the game it needs to be playing? I actually had someone on the podcast that I did, and she used to do bodybuilding shows, and it got to the point for her where she was not losing weight. The weight was climbing, and she had to see 7 doctors before someone was like, oh, maybe it's your thyroid. And she went down this massive rabbit hole, now specializes as a functional doctor in thyroid health, quite an incredible human. But it just goes to show that, again, that calories in, calories out isn't going to be everything. If you've got something at the root cause that is driving your body to hold on to weight, because maybe you have done, excessive weight loss before and you've damaged your metabolism or your thyroid. Maybe you are eating too little and that's telling your body or your thyroid, hey, actually slow down that metabolism. We're burning too rapidly. Again, we're protecting our body from potential famine. We need to hold on to more weight. So it all kind of ties in together. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's super interesting. And maybe diving more into the thyroid, if someone does have slow thyroid, hypo, what are some ways of getting it back online and speeding it back up a little bit?
So one of the biggest things you want to do is make sure that your body is converting the inactive thyroid hormone, so T4, to T3, which is your active thyroid hormone. Then it can do its job with the TSH, which is your thyroid stimulating hormone, and that's what's going to regulate your metabolism. So again, I'll quite often test all 3 of those on a thyroid panel to make sure everything's working effectively. But there are key nutrients that your body needs to make sure that the thyroid can do its job effectively. So we've got iron, iodine, selenium, and zinc. Those are the 4 key nutrients that your body needs. Now, we don't get enough iodine in our soil. We don't get enough selenium in our soil. We certainly don't get enough zinc. And so what I'll often see is, especially if you think about athletes or people who train a lot, especially females, because we're losing blood every month, is their iron levels can be all over the place. A lot of anemia can go on, and that can cause the thyroid to be up. If we're looking at males, the thyroid can be thrown out by high levels of iron, because I often see these high levels of inflammation in the body. So your ferritin's really high. That's going to cause the thyroid to go out. And so it's fine-tuning this balance. It's, we used to, in New Zealand, like have the little white and blue iodized table salt that would sit, for what you'd put on your meal. And everyone has moved to this pink Himalayan rock salt, right? That has no iodine in it.
Interesting.
And so we're actually not getting the nutrients that we need. Now, the iodine in the iodized table salt still isn't the best form, but it was better than the pink Himalayan rock salt, which has no iodine in it at all. I recommend something like kelp salt, because kelp is naturally super, super high in iodine. And so that, I think it's a teaspoon of that across all your meals per day will get your recommended daily intake right there. So it's a very easy way to put the nutrient back into your food, to put the iodine into your diet without necessarily doing any harm or anything like that. I know a lot of people are afraid of salt, but salt is actually incredible for you. It's one of your electrolytes. You need it.
Yes.
Things like selenium, 2 Brazil nuts a day. Very, very easy to do through food. Like, I'm always a food first approach. If we need the supplement, we can, but it's actually safer for us to get things like iodine and selenium through food than it is through a supplement, because if we're dealing with a thyroid issue, it can start to throw things out. So again, safety first always. And then you do want to check your iron, because you never want to supplement if your iron's too high. That can cause a whole host of issues. And then the zinc. The zinc is one of the ones that I will supplement with, because unless you're eating a bucket of oysters every single day, you're probably not mixing your zinc into. Yeah, it'd be delicious, but most of us can't do that.
Expensive.
Very expensive. So that's another thing you want to be adding in. And then on the flip side of that, those are the nutrients you need to make the thyroid work. Gluten is the nutrient that can, I guess you can call it a nutrient. I don't know. I wouldn't that can stop the thyroid from working effectively, because it actually competes for the receptors on the thyroid gland and can block the uptake of those thyroid hormones, and therefore cause a whole host of issues. So when we are dealing with people who've got autoimmune, like Hashimoto's, gluten's a no-no for the rest of their life because of the impact it can have.
Wow, I never knew the thyroid was such a complex thing. Like, I suppose I knew of it, but didn't know how deep it can get. And the next thing, and still on the same vein, but the next thing I wanted to talk to you about was measuring progress and how you measure these things. And one of the things you mentioned in there was getting a blood test. And I've always felt, not that I've actually ever gone for one, but I've always felt that it's difficult to just go in and say, hey, I need a blood panel of all these things. So in the real world, how do people actually go about getting a blood test to test for this kind of stuff?
This is a conversation that it really rugs me up, to be honest, because you have every right to understand what's going on in your body and request the medical support that you want. Some doctors are amazing, like find a good one, and find a good one that will listen to you. Like mine, I walk in and I'm like, oh, these are the ones I want to get tested. Thank you very much. And he writes them out and I go and get them done. Bearing in mind, like if we're thinking about places like New Zealand, and I'm sure it's the same when you're over in places in Europe as well, because a lot of the medical system is government funded. It's, technically taxpayers' dollars, but you know what I mean? That's why I'm like, well, if I want blood tests, I pay my taxes. But if I was to, as a nutritionist, say to you, here, you can go and order these online, because there are places online you can order, right? If you want to do them personally, you're looking at about $500, like New Zealand dollars, to get the full blood panel that you'd want versus the doctor's visit. And so if you find a good doctor, and I mean, they will typically allow you to do a full blood panel of everything that I would normally request once a year. And that's really often enough. And if something pops up on their radar, they'll test it more frequently. But I look at bloods very, very different. And this is why a lot of people will come to me and go, my bloods are all normal and I'm still feeling like crap. And it's like, if you look at them from a functional medicine perspective, from an optimal health perspective, our ranges are so, so small. Whereas if you're looking at the doctor's ranges, and it's not that they're wrong, they're simply looking for the presence or absence of disease. And is there a medication I can give you to support? But I'm like, can we catch it before it gets to one end of the spectrum and make sure that you bring you back to optimal before you need that medication in the first place? So to answer your question, you can go to the doctors, and if that doctor won't do it, find another doctor. Like, who's to say you can't? Like, you have every right to look after your health. And, I've had women leave doctor's offices crying because, like, who are you with? Why would you want that? Why are you working with nutritionists? Like, just completely berating people for wanting and taking more of an interest in their well-being, which is appalling. And it comes down to, as much as it can be hard, just being an advocate for yourself and going out there and making sure you get someone that is willing to support you. Or there is, like I say, the option of ordering them online.
Yeah. You think it would just be something that should just be more readily available? Like you say, if people are just wanting to learn more about their health and how to become healthier. And this is one very beneficial tool. You'd think it would just be more readily available. It doesn't take long to do a blood test, but maybe they don't want the whole country going in to get blood tests done just to check their levels when nothing is immediately wrong.
Well, like I said, then it ends up costing the taxpayers or the government $500 versus you having to fork that out. But I'm like, doing it once a year, I really don't see the problem with this.
Yeah, exactly. And in terms of measuring other things, so obviously if we're wanting to lose body fat, we want to actually know if we're losing body fat. So when it comes to measuring it and then also implementing changes, maybe when we've reached plateaus, what does that look like? What kind of tools do you typically use there to measure the progress?
I always say to people, pick one thing and stick with it, because I still remember the first time I went and had one of those body scan things.
Yeah.
I'd been tracking my body fat with calipers. So this is way back when I was into calorie counting and everything. And I was like, oh, I'm down to 15% and I'm feeling really good. And like, progress is progress. And then I stepped on the body scan thing and I burst into tears when I went back into the staff room. And I was like, I'm at 25%. Why did I put on
25?
I was like, how did I put on 10% body fat? And I was like, all these things going through your brain, right? Yeah. And so that's where I say to my clients, pick one way of measuring and stick to that, right? If you're jumping around too often, or this one said that, or even the same set of scales, if you are specifically focused on weight, same time of day, same day each week, and no more than once a week. Because your body does fluctuate. And if you are a female, your hormones are going to fluctuate in terms of your cycle, that sort of thing as well. So I think when it comes to tracking progress, the main thing is one way. And maybe that is body fat calipers with circumferences, with the scales. Like that's typically what I do, and it gives you a very well-rounded picture. It's very easy to do. You can have someone at your local gym do it for you, or getting a regular body scan, just step on one of those once a month. And you can make adjustments from there. Maybe it's your favorite pair of jeans. Okay, cool. They're past the thighs now. Now they're up at the waist. Okay, we can't quite do the button up. Like, it really depends on what the goal is. Maybe it's when they look in the mirror and they're like, oh, okay, there's still a little bit there that I'm not quite happy with. So picking your method, I think, is really the most important thing, and what you feel comfortable with. I'm never going to tell someone to step on the scales that feels uncomfortable stepping on the scales.
Yeah, and it is something, I guess you mentioned it there by looking in the mirror, but do you take progress photos or progress videos to be able to visually compare as well?
I personally don't. I have in the past, and sometimes it's quite insightful. Some coaches will recommend it. Again, if that's what people feel comfortable doing, amazing. I do think sometimes just looking in the mirror isn't quite enough. So I do think progress photos can be really helpful, because you can actually see week to week or every couple of weeks, like, oh, there is a shift happening here, and it can be really re-motivating for people as well. So I don't have a problem with them. But if you were to ever look at my Instagram, you will see I never do before and afters, because I don't focus primarily on that being the outcome or the objective.
Yeah. And in terms of when we do hit the plateau, because it's probably almost inevitable, what are some of the typical changes you implement to a plan? We already mentioned one, how cardio is a bit of a tool, but what other things do you bring into a plan when you or someone who you're training reaches a plateau?
I mean, it's generally, the way I approach weight loss is generally fixing the body at the root cause. And so plateaus are actually a lot less common when you're not coming at it just from a shred perspective, if that makes sense. I will ramp up the protein. I may get them to increase their weight training a little bit more, or push their weights up a bit higher. I may add in, like we said, the cardio component. I may look at other things that support your basal metabolic rate, or your metabolic rate, I should say. So are you getting enough NEAT, which is like your non-exercise activity thermogenesis? Are you actually supporting your body in the foods you're eating? Are you getting enough fiber? Are you getting, like, the protein works in twofold in terms of, yes, you're meeting your protein goals, recovery, all that sort of thing, but it also can bring in something called the thermic effect of food. And so it actually creates a lot of energy being expended by your body having to process the protein. It's like, remember being taught when I was little that if you ate the celery, it actually takes more energy to eat the celery than it is in terms of caloric expenditure for the celery itself. So you can start to play around with some of those things to really ramp things up. But I very rarely will reduce food. Very rarely will reduce food, because a lot of the times we're already working with a subpar metabolism, and women are on a lower calorie intake as it is. So if I go and then take away, and I remember that was how I first lost the weight, drop the fats down to 10%, you're going to screw up the hormones. So you got to be real careful.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And I suppose my background in the bodybuilding space, it's not exactly a holistic a hormone balance sort of approach. It's like, okay, how shredded can we get?
Yeah.
Okay, you got to be on 1,200 calories now and double cardio, and you're doing a deplete. Yep, sweet, we got to do it. And obviously there's the reverse diet and all that stuff too, if you're doing it right. So it's super interesting hearing it from that perspective of a focus on hormones, more of a focus on lifestyle, more of a focus on a holistic perspective. It's not just about driving the output up as high as you can and driving the input down as low as you can, right?
Yeah, well, that's when we start to damage the metabolism. And so I'm always bearing that in mind. And that's why, when we set that goal right at the beginning, it's being a realist. It is going, okay, this is going to take a little while. You may plateau for a couple of weeks, but your body will then rev things up. Some things I do play with, things like saunas, cold exposure, getting the mitochondria, which is your little powerhouse of your cells, to burn energy more effectively. So again, it's all about optimization, because that is going to serve you for years to come versus ramp up the output, ramp up the stress, reduce the food going in. Yeah, cool, you look shredded for about 4 weeks. Then most people will not have the discipline to reverse diet effectively, put all the weight back on. Oh my gosh, I failed. In comes all the mind stories, and we're right back to square one, if not worse.
Yeah, and it's things like the cold exposure. It's actually wild how much that challenges the body and actually promotes the calorie burning, right? Especially like the showers, definitely, but the baths, especially, right? The amount of energy that is, exchanged over the barrier, basically, the heat energy that's coming out of you, right?
It's that, and it also turns the white fat to brown fat.
Yes, that's right.
Which
is easier to burn.
Active tissue. Yes.
Yeah.
So cold exposure is amazing. So when you start, when you go into plateaus, that's when you can start to play that in. The saunas, whilst it doesn't turn the white fat to brown fat, we don't sweat anywhere near as much as we used to. We constantly have air conditioning. We're constantly, in our warm, comfortable little environments in our offices or our homes, and we're not sweating unless we are going to the gym and training. And even then, someone like myself, it takes a lot for me to get a really, really good sweat on it just by doing weights. And so it's really important to give your body the mechanism of sweat, because the sweating is going to release those toxins. It is going to get your tissues a lot more metabolically active. If you're even adding a red light therapy-based sauna, that's going to support you even further in recharging those mitochondria, which is then going to make sure your metabolism is more optimized. So it's things like that you can really start to play with.
When it comes to specific things that you're consuming or people who you train are consuming, where do things like cheat meals and alcohol and maybe even specific foods, we've mentioned a few cliche ones like potato chips and all these kind of things, where do those things factor into the plan? Are there any hard lines where you're just like, nah, no cheat meals, nah, you're not allowed potato chips, can't drink any wine? Where do you stand with these kind of inflammatory, quote unquote, unhealthy options?
So I guess because I come from that background of prioritizing the mindset around food and not developing or worsening people's relationship with food, the concept of a cheat meal or a treat meal, I completely abolish. We don't even bring that into the work that I do, because, and to share openly and honestly, when I would do that, it was a big binge.
Yeah.
I'm not even, I can still remember one time it was a half a pizza and a whole burger and fries, and then I'd have dessert on top of that, because I'm like, well, it's treat night. And or cheat night. Even if you, the word cheat, if we even think about what that often means for people and the connotations that it can have, it's this dirty, this is not right, this is bad. And so often then comes with a whole lot of guilt, which can then actually encourage our body to hold on to more weight. We don't have to go into all of that. That's a whole side tangent in itself. So the biggest thing that I say to people is the first 2 weeks, I need you to give me 2 weeks solid. No nasties going in. It needs to be 2 weeks whole food, because your body needs to trust that this is the new way of being, right? Your metabolism needs a reset. It needs to know, oh, okay, inflammation's coming down. We're not stressing the body out. We're regulating our blood sugar levels. There's enough protein coming in. 2 weeks. And so I said, if you aren't seeing results within 2 weeks, it's not going to be massive results. If you aren't seeing weight shift, if you aren't seeing your body getting better in 2 weeks, something else is going on, and we need to address that. So yes, there is a period of time where I do want you to be quite strict on yourself. If you can give me 4, amazing. Then we start to weave things in. Often we're dealing with gut issues or hormonal imbalances or something else going on. So we're typically attending to address those in that 4-week, 8-week process. And then the weight is already starting to shift during that time as a byproduct of really healing yourself. But if we think about adding in, do we have chocolate? Do we have alcohol? Do we have, some of those other things? That really comes back to that intuitive eating. And I always want people to feel empowered. So instead of coming from this, I can't because Sheree told me not to, or I can't because I'm on a diet, or I can't, it's I don't. And then if they feel like it, say it's a big celebration, say they've got a daughter's engagement party or something, say it's, a friend's birthday and they want to go out and celebrate, or say they're having a movie night at a friend's place and they want to enjoy some popcorn and chocolate, like simple things in life, right? Is this going to serve me in this moment? And it's as simple as asking yourself a question like that, because if you then go, yeah, it is. Actually, I'm really going to enjoy the social element. I'm going to enjoy this because I really, really feel like this right now. Maybe you really feel like a glass of wine, or maybe you really feel like a piece of chocolate or half a block of chocolate, right? Your body's going to process that food or that alcohol so much differently because you're coming from a far healthier mindset and a far healthier perspective, and you're far less likely to overeat, to overdrink, because there's no guilt or restriction or fear associated around that food. And so that is one big way that I will get people to do it. The other way is you are typically, and again, for the sake of my maths, bear with me with my my analogy here, but if you are eating, say, 2 small snacks a day and your breakfast, lunch, and dinner, it's about 35 meals a week, right, over 7 days. If 2 or 3 of them, after you've given your body that metabolic reset, after you've taught your body that it's feeling safe, you've got some sort of what we call metabolic flexibility. If 2 or 3 meals aren't ideal out of 35, it's not going to be the thing that tips the scale over the edge. If you are excess consuming in a treat or cheat form, yes, definitely. But if you're talking having a couple glasses of wine with a friend on a Friday night, if you're talking buying a lunch out and you're still choosing, something that has some protein in it, and maybe you add a side of greens, like still choosing healthier options, and that doesn't mean you still can't have the pasta or whatever. It's just making sure there's enough protein. But if you're only having 3 of those meals, say out of 35, that's 32 meals where you're still meeting exactly what you need to be doing, eating whole real foods and nourishing your body. So that's not going to be what restricts your progress. And so ultimately, if you don't have that metabolic flexibility and you're 100% stuck on something, that's where we start to see issues. That's where the weight's going to jump back on. If you give yourself 12 weeks of being 100% clean and you add stuff in, you're undoing your progress as well.
Yeah, man, there's so many good points in there. One thing that sort of reframing that I can't versus I don't, it reminds me of Atomic Habits. And he was saying, describe yourself as the person you want to be. I think it was like in regards to smoking. He was like, I'm not a smoker. Like that becomes your identity. So I could see how that, where it's like, oh, I can't do that today. I'm on this 12-week cut, blah, 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 versus, oh, I don't really drink or I don't really eat those kind of things. It doesn't mean that you can't, but I could see how that reframing breaks that association. And it's almost like the I can't is a restrictive thing. And I feel like intuitively our body almost maybe wants it more because there's this whole thing about like, I can't have it.
Yeah. And it is. It's that, like you say, it is full restriction. As soon as you hear the word can't, a lot of us are internally wired to go, well, I want it more now.
Yeah.
Right? Or if someone says you can't do something, let me show you. I will do
Yeah.
it. Right? And so it's that internal fire that it can build versus I don't comes from a very empowered place. I don't need that. And it also, even if you were saying it to someone, they're far more likely, oh, why can't you? Why can't you do that?
Yeah.
Oh, you want a diet? Oh, why can't you drink tonight? And it's like you get the painful, Nancy's that stick their nose into everything. And it's you almost, and then you have to rely on your willpower. And willpower is so small, right? Whereas I don't is coming from your internal source of power. It is going, that's just who I am. Like you say, it's that form of that identity. People actually don't question. They might be curious. Oh, why don't you drink? That's interesting. It's a completely different conversation, not only with yourself, but with other people around you when you say it.
Yeah. It's just making me reflect a lot on how I approach food and stuff like that. And I could see how the I can't, like you say, that opens you up for way more persuasion from your peers. It's staff drinks or it's a staff lunch. And you're like, oh no, I can't drink today. I'm on this plane. Oh no, surely you can have one. What, you can't even have one piece of chocolate? Oh, surely you can have one glass of, and it's just the constant sort of barrage of, and they're only trying to have fun, it's coming from a nice place, but they're trying to convince you to not stick to the thing that you're trying to stick to.
And then there's a constant internal battle. Like I said, it's that you're then having to make that decision every single time, and it wears you very thin. If they say it 3 or 4 times, surely you can have just one. Oh, come on, mate. It's just one drink. Or you can't really. And that might be coming from 3 or 4 different people. You've then had to say, no. And then by the 4th time, you're like, okay, if it's going to shut you up, I'll have the lemon drink. And you've worn down yourself, and you then compromise, and then you feel guilty, and then you feel like crap, and then you've had the alcohol, you've had the thing, and you're like, I really didn't even want that.
Exactly.
This is my body. I should have every right to say what I, do and don't want to do. But that can't is really one of the languages that doesn't support us, doesn't help us in that space.
Yeah. It's so interesting framing it like that. I haven't really thought about it like that. To maybe tie the episode off, I wasn't really anticipating it to go like this, but we've kind of did the initiating, the doing the thing, and then I actually thought, I didn't have this planned, but how do we know when to complete or to stop a fat loss phase? You're obviously not going to be in a calorie deficit for the rest of your life, and like we've said, there's that goal and stuff, but how do we complete or know when to complete a cutting phase, and what does it look like after that in terms of our nutrition and our training and those aspects?
I think it comes back to when you get to where you're happy with, it's learning to maintain that. And this is where, we see a lot of the time, and I've been guilty of it time and time again, but we drop into that self-sabotage. Ooh, I got to where I want to get to. And it can be a very unconscious, I can afford to have that pizza, that extra slice of pizza now, or I can afford to have a few extra glasses of wine. And so I think it's a huge part of it is mindset and going, I'm continuing to choose to nourish my body. And that's why, I don't run 12-week challenges and things like that, because that then gives us this idea that there's an end in sight. This is a new way of being. If you're doing a card, or if you're doing it's a little bit different if you're actually shredding, and then you're wanting to bulk and play around with all that sort of thing. But if you're just wanting to shift weight and be in a fat loss phase and then maintain where you're at, you need to treat the next couple months after you achieve your goal like you're still in that space, still nourishing your body, still make it, because then it becomes a lifestyle. Your metabolism learns that it's at that new set point. You create, like we talked about a little bit, that metabolic flexibility, so you can have a few meals here or there. You can indulge a little bit, maybe more than you were before, but it teaches your body the boundaries and the parameters and where you really want to stay. So I think it's keeping the commitment more than anything to yourself and continuing to choose yourself, and then realizing that that's your new normal, and that gets to be your new normal, and keeping the protein up, keeping the fiber up, choosing healthy whole food meals. Maybe you weren't weight training before and it's now become a part of your life. It's just keeping those habits in, and then it's no longer this, it's like, it's not just about the destination. It's choosing this to be a lifelong journey and staying in the space that you want to be in.
And that's probably more of a mental battle than actually working down towards the deadline, because
It is.
especially if it is a specific date, I'm going to Europe on the 17th of June or whatever it is, it's very tangible. But
Yes.
then after that, it's like, oh, I better maintain this now. It's like that maybe it's about creating more of a why that you're getting to there, like something deeper. Why is it that you should maintain it? You want to maintain your healthy hormone balance. You want to maintain this healthy lifestyle that you have. It's kind of that training without purpose sort of idea at the same time, right?
Yeah, and then it might look at, okay, well, I want to get stronger, or it might be, wow, this is actually, giving me a little bit more confidence, and I want to continue to feel really confident in my body. Maybe it's, I really like the energy or the lightness that I feel when I treat my body with this respect and I support my body this way. It is coming back to that, I guess, creating that deeper why and that different why, but it is like you can maintain it, I think, with quite a lot of ease if you have that deeper intention from the start rather than this idea that it's this short-term fix.
Yeah, I totally agree about the 12-week challenges or the 6-week shred for summer, or I don't know, whatever other buzzwords are out there, because it does just perpetuate that idea of cutting, do whatever, oh, got to cut again, do whatever, oh, got to do another 12-week challenge. And it just has to be more holistic than that, like a lifestyle or an identity thing, like we touched on.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Nice. I feel like that's a good spot to wrap it up. I don't know about you. I feel like we kind of did a nice arc there from initiating it to doing the thing to completing the thing. And I find it super interesting getting your perspective on fat loss, because so often like in this bodybuilding space, and I'll be talking to bodybuilders or bodybuilding coaches, and I love that stuff too, and that's very specific to bodybuilding. Obviously, we're not saying as a lifestyle person you should do this, but the perspective of just what can benefit the general population who aren't wanting to step on stage at sub 5% body fat and maintain a healthy hormone balance. It's super interesting, and I appreciate you coming on again and diving into that kind of stuff.
Oh, more than happy to. Always, and if there are listeners that have a bunch of questions that follow up with this, by all means, flick them my way. I'm more than happy to help, because I think it can spark so much more. Oh gosh, I didn't think of it that way, or I didn't look at it that way. And so, yeah, if I've left you with more questions than answers, don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, and another segue, man. You're on fire today. Whereabouts can people find you if they are wanting to reach out?
I'm Sheree Hannah Wellness everywhere.com, at TikTok, Instagram, everything is just Sheree Hannah Wellness. So very easy to kind of find me across the board there.
Perfect. Easy. Thanks heaps again, Sheree. Once again, I appreciate your time, and that was super interesting. I enjoyed that.
Awesome. Thanks, Cam. Thanks for having me.